Congratulations, you've made it to lesson 20 and you've completed the entirety of the course. Over the past 19 lessons, you've learned the core ideas that economists use to understand the world. But here's the interesting thing. Economics isn't really just about graphs and numbers. It's not about memorizing definitions, and it's definitely not about remembering complicated formulas. Economics is about learning how to think. In this final lesson, we're going to bring everything together and see what it truly means to think like an economist. Now, let's take a moment to look back at what we've covered. We've learned how markets work, why markets sometimes fail, how governments intervene, and how entire economies grow, trade, and develop. But learning economics isn't simply collecting lots of separate ideas. It's about learning how to analyze real-world problems. Today, we'll review the tools you've learned, apply them to real-world policy questions, and see how economists make balanced judgments. Because economics isn't about finding perfect answers. It's about making better decisions using evidence and logical reasoning. So, what exactly is in an economist's toolkit? The first tool is models. Models simplify reality so we can understand complicated situations. Think about supply and demand or the production possibility frontier. The second tool is elasticity. Elasticity helps us predict how people will respond when prices or income change. Third, economists rely heavily on data and evidence. Good economics isn't based on opinions, it's based on facts. Fourth is marginal thinking. Economists don't usually ask, is this policy good or bad? Instead, they ask, what are the additional costs and additional benefits of making one more change? And finally, economists use cost benefit analysis, weighing the total benefits of a decision against its total costs. These are the tools you've been building throughout this course. Now, let's see how economists actually use these tools. Consider this question. Should the government increase taxes on private school fees to fund state education? This is a real policy debate in several countries. Notice something important. There isn't one simple diagram that gives us the answer. Instead, economists combine many different ideas. We might ask, how much will demand for private schools fall? That's a question about demand and supply. How sensitive are parents to higher fees? That's about price elasticity of demand. Will the policy improve access to education? That's about equity. Will education generate wider benefits to society? That's about positive externalities. Could there be unintended consequences like school closures or reduced investment? And finally, will resources be used more efficiently? No single model answers every question. Instead, economists combine multiple tools to build a balanced analysis. Another habit of good economics is thinking about time. A policy may have very different effects in the short run compared to the long run. Take education spending. Building new schools is expensive today, but over many years, better education increases skills, productivity, and innovation. Similarly, increasing interest rates may reduce inflation fairly quickly, but it could also slow economic growth in the short term. Whenever economists analyze a policy, they ask, what happens today? And equally importantly, what happens in 5 or 10 years from now? Looking beyond the immediate effects often changes the conclusion. Now, another important distinction you've learned is the difference between positive and normative economics. A positive statement describes what is likely to happen. For example, increasing taxes may reduce demand. That's something we can test using evidence. A normative statement is different. It reflects a value judgment. For example, the government should increase taxes to improve equality. Reasonable people can disagree about this because it depends on personal values. Good economics understand that public policy usually combine both evidence and values. Facts help us understand what might happen. Values help society decide what it wants to achieve. Economics is an incredibly powerful subject, but it's also important to recognize its limits. Economics cannot perfectly predict the future. People don't always behave exactly as models suggest. Unexpected events like financial crises, wars, or pandemics can completely change economic outcomes. Economics can also cannot remove uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, economics cannot replace ethical judgment. It can tell us the likely consequences of different choices, but society still has to decide which outcome it values the most. Economics provides structure, not certainty. Now, so how do you build a strong economic argument? First, use the appropriate diagrams when they help you explain your reasoning. Second, support your points with evidence and real-world examples. Third, acknowledge trade-offs. Almost every policy creates both benefits and costs. Fourth, consider multiple perspectives. Try to understand why reasonable people might disagree. And finally, reach a balanced conclusion. The strongest economics arguments are rarely extreme. They're thoughtful, evidence-based, and recognize complexity. Now let's reflect how far you've come. You can now analyze how markets work, understand why governments intervene, interpret economic data, evaluate policy trade-offs, and think critically about incentives and decision making. These aren't just useful skills for economics exams. They're useful for understanding business, politics, finance, public policy, and, most importantly, everyday life. Whenever you read a news article about inflation, taxes, housing, or trade, you'll now have the tools to analyze it more critically. Now, as we finish this course, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Economics begins with a simple idea. Resources are limited, but human wants are unlimited. That problem never disappears. Technology changes, governments change, markets evolve, but scarcity will always remain. And that's why economics will always matter. Thinking like an economist means asking thoughtful questions, weighing evidence carefully, recognizing trade-offs, and making informed decisions rather than jumping to conclusions. If this course has changed the way you look at the world, even just a little, then it's achieved its goal. Thank you very much for joining me throughout the course, and I hope this is just the beginning of your journey into economics. Thank you, everyone.